Welcome to another deep dive. You guys sent in a study about EHV1 outbreaks, and what's really interesting is that in these two outbreaks, it was the same strain of the virus, and it happened in the same place around the same time of year, but the outcomes were so different.
Yeah, so we're going to be looking at a study in the Journal of Veterinary Internal Medicine that compares two outbreaks that happened in Valencia, Spain, and these were in February 2021 and then again in 2023.
So both of these outbreaks happened at international show jumping events, and the horses were similar in age, breed makeup, and vaccination status. So what happened in that first outbreak in 2021?
Well, unfortunately, the 2021 outbreak was pretty severe. We saw 24% of the horses at the competition needing intensive care. And unfortunately, 32% of those horses died. And of the horses that survived, only about 12% were able to get back to competition within 6 months.
Wow, that is really sad. So then what happened in 2023?
Yeah, so 2023 was a much milder outbreak. 12% of the horses still needed to go to the hospital, but there were no deaths. And all of the horses were able to return to competition within 6 months.
So same strain, similar horses, same place, same time of year, totally different outcomes. That's so strange. So what did these researchers find when they really dug into the details?
One of the biggest things they noticed was the complications that the horses had. So in 2021, a huge number, 64% of the horses developed problems with urinating, like they couldn't pee or they had bladder infections. But in 2023, none of the horses had those problems.
That's a big difference. Were there any other differences like that?
Yes, one of the other things they saw was a difference in vasculitis. So that's inflammation of the blood vessels.
Okay, and how did that look different between the two outbreaks?
Well, again, the 2021 outbreak had a lot more vasculitis. 64% of the horses had signs of it. And then in the 2023 outbreak, only 20% of the horses did.
Okay, so it sounds like how bad the inflammation was, especially the vasculitis and those urinary problems, really made a difference in how these outbreaks went.
That's right. And that's one of the big takeaways from this study.
Yeah.
You know, just knowing what strain of the virus it is isn't enough to tell you what's going to happen. It seems like how bad the inflammation gets, especially in the blood vessels, is a much bigger deal when it comes to how the horses are going to do. So before we go any further, it's important to remember that this virus, EHV1, can cause a bunch of different problems in horses.
Right, like respiratory problems or even abortions. But we're really focusing on those neurological problems today.
Exactly. And that's when the virus messes with the blood vessels in the brain and spinal cord. That's what we call EHM.
Okay, that makes sense. So we were just talking about how important the inflammatory response is and how it seems like that's a big part of how bad an outbreak is. So how did the researchers look into that more?
Well, one thing they looked at was something called lymphopenia.
And lymphopenia, that's when the horse doesn't have enough lymphocytes in their blood, right?
Yeah, exactly. Lymphocytes are those white blood cells that are really important for fighting off infections.
All right, so if a horse has lymphopenia, it's going to have a harder time fighting the virus.
That's right. And the researchers found that the horses in both outbreaks had pretty high rates of lymphopenia.
So their immune systems were kind of struggling to deal with the virus.
Yeah, and that could explain why the inflammation was so bad. But there are probably other things going on too, like vaccination was something the researchers talked about.
Oh yeah, that's always a big topic for horse owners.
What?
What did they find about vaccination in these outbreaks?
Well, the vaccination rates were actually pretty similar in both outbreaks. But here's the thing, there's still a lot of debate about how well these vaccines actually work to prevent EHM.
So even though horse owners are vaccinating their horses, it might not be doing much to stop them from getting really sick.
Yeah, and some studies have even suggested that some vaccines might actually increase the risk of EHM.
Wow, that's really concerning. What should horse owners do then?
Well, it really highlights how important it is to talk to your vet. You know, they can look at each horse and figure out what their risk factors are and what the best plan is for them. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing.
Okay, so we need more research to figure out which vaccines work best for which horses and in what situations.
Right. And the researchers also brought up another possibility, which is that there could be genetic differences in the virus itself.
Even though it was the same strain in both outbreaks.
Exactly. Even small changes in the virus's genes could change how it interacts with the horse's immune system.
So maybe one variant of the virus could cause a worse inflammatory response than another one?
Yeah, that's what they're thinking. But unfortunately, they weren't able to do full DNA sequencing on the virus from the 2023 outbreak.
So we don't know for sure if there were actually genetic differences.
Right. It's still a bit of a mystery, but it definitely adds another layer of complexity to this whole thing. You know, there's still a lot we don't understand about EHV1.
Definitely. So were there any other things the researchers looked at to try to understand the inflammatory response?
Yeah, they talked about these things called cytokines and chemokines.
Those are those signaling molecules, right?
Yeah, exactly. They basically control how the virus, the immune system, and the blood vessels all talk to each other.
Okay, and how do those play a role in EHM?
Well, when a horse gets infected with EHV1, it triggers a whole chain reaction that leads to the production of these pro-inflammatory cytokines.
And those cytokines, what do they do?
They cause all sorts of problems. They make the blood vessels sticky, so white blood cells and platelets start clumping together, and that can lead to blood clots and inflammation, especially in the blood vessels of the brain and spinal cord.
Oh, wow. So it's like a domino effect.
Right.
The virus comes in, it triggers the cytokines, and then everything starts to go haywire.
Right, and then you got those neurological signs that we see in EHM.
So this inflammatory response, it's like a double-edged sword. It's trying to fight off the virus, but can also cause a lot of damage.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important to understand how it all works. If we can figure out how to control the inflammation, we might be able to prevent some of the worst effects of EHM.
So what did the researchers say we need to do next?
They really emphasize the need for more research specifically on those cytokines and chemokines. If we can learn more about how they work, we might be able to develop treatments that can target them and reduce the inflammation.
That would be amazing. So it sounds like we're just starting to scratch the surface of understanding EHM.
Oh yeah, definitely. This study was a great step forward, but there's still so much more to learn.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. And for a listener who sent in this study, thank you so much for giving us such an interesting topic to explore. We'll be back in the next part to wrap up our discussion and talk about what all of this means for managing EHM. All right, we're back and ready to wrap up this deep dive into these 2 EHM outbreaks. We've learned so much about how important that inflammatory response is in determining how bad this disease can be.
Yeah, and the study really makes you think. You can't just look at what strain the virus is. You have to understand how it interacts with the horse's immune system and all those inflammatory signals.
Right. So knowing all this, how do we move forward? How do we actually use this knowledge to manage EHM better?
I think the big thing is we need to start thinking more holistically. We can't just focus on killing the virus. We have to manage the inflammation and really pay attention to those complications that can make it harder for the horse to recover.
So like we talked about those urinary problems and the vasculitis, those are things we need to catch early.
Exactly. The sooner you catch those problems and start treating them, the better the chances are that the horse will be okay.
So it sounds like we're moving towards a more individualized approach to treating EHM.
Yeah, that's right. We need to look at each horse as an individual, think about their specific risk factors, and come up with a treatment plan that makes sense for them. Maybe they need supportive care to help with those neurological symptoms. Maybe they need fluids because they're dehydrated. And maybe they need medications to control the inflammation.
This study really highlighted how much we still have to learn about EHM. What are some of the big questions that still need to be answered?
But we still need to figure out exactly what those inflammatory mediators are doing. Like, how are they contributing to the damage in the brain and spinal cord? If we can figure that out, maybe we can find ways to block them and protect the horse's brain.
And what about those genetic differences in the virus? Do we need more research on that?
Oh, yeah, definitely. We need to know how those little genetic tweaks can affect how severe the disease is. That could help us predict what might happen in future outbreaks and make better decisions about prevention and treatment.
This has been a truly fascinating deep dive. And to our listener who sent in this study, thank you so much for suggesting such a thought-provoking topic. It seems like we're really starting to make some progress in understanding EHM, and hopefully all this new knowledge will lead to better ways to protect these amazing animals.
From Vet NeuroJar, keep those minds, inspired hearts, light and tails wagging.